There's a moment early in this story that almost nobody tells. A young Army lieutenant is falling out of a Kansas sky in a fragile machine of wood and wire and stretched cloth. The engine sits behind him, close enough to feel its heat on the back of his neck. The controls have gone soft and strange in his hands. The aircraft stalls, drops a wing, and begins to spin toward the prairie. And the man flying it does not understand why and does not know how to make it stop. It is the 5th of November, 1912. He is 26 years old. He gets the machine level a few feet above the grass, more by luck than by any skill he can name, and he climbs out of it white and shaking, and he cannot tell anyone what just happened because he does not know. And then he does something that tells you almost everything about the cost buried in the rest of this story. He grounds himself. He asks to be taken off flying duty, and he stays off it for the better part of 4 years. Later, he will confess, in plain words, that he cannot even look at an airplane in the air without feeling certain that some accident is about to happen to it. Sit with that for a second. The man who would one day build the largest and most powerful air force the world had ever seen. The man who would send tens of thousands of young Americans up into the flak and the fighters over Germany and over Japan was once so frightened of flight that he could not bear to watch it happen to somebody else. His name was Henry Harley Arnold. The Army called him Hap, short for happy, because he almost always seemed to be smiling. And here is the number that hangs over everything that Smile ever built. Before the Second World War was finished, the 8th Air Force alone, just one of the commands under this one man, would suffer more fatal casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps did in the whole of the Pacific War. Roughly 26,000 young men dead in the bomber crews of a single Air Force. That figure is debated, and we're going to be honest about that debate as we go, but the shape of it is not in serious question. More dead in the heavy bombers of one Air Force than in the whole Marine Corps across every island in the Pacific. And the men who designed the strategy that killed them, and the man who drove that strategy forward when the losses came pouring in, were not in the aircraft. They were on the ground, in England and in Washington, reading the loss reports over breakfast, and deciding whether to send the boys back up again tomorrow. So this is a trial. I want to be clear about that from the very start. We are going to put Hap Arnold in the dock, and we are going to hear the case for him and the case against him, and I am not going to hand you a verdict at the end. I am going to hand you the evidence, and you are going to decide. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story, fathers and grandfathers who flew for this man or served under the men he commanded. I want to do it justice, because the honest truth is that both of these things are true at the same time. Hap Arnold built the greatest air force on Earth, and he broke a great many of the men who flew it. The hard part, the part that has kept serious historians arguing for 80 years, is deciding whether the first of those things could ever have happened without the second. Let us start with the man himself, because you cannot judge the cost of what he built until you understand where he came from and what it took out of him. Henry Harley Arnold was born on the 25th of June, 1886, in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, the son of a physician who ran his household like a small and rather severe command. Here is a fact that should stop you. Arnold never wanted to be a soldier at all. He was pointed toward the ministry, and he only sat the entrance examination for West Point because his older brother, who had been chosen for it, flatly refused to go. Arnold placed second among the local candidates, and he won his appointment only when the young man ahead of him was discovered to be secretly married, which barred him. So the founder of the modern American Air Force reached West Point almost by accident, a substitute for a brother who did not want to serve and a rival who was quietly disqualified. At the academy, he was not a scholar and not a saint. He was a prankster, a ringleader, the head of a cadet society that got into more trouble than the faculty ever fully uncovered. He played polo, he ran the football, he collected demerits, and he graduated in 1907 ranked 66th in a class of 111. He wanted the cavalry more than he wanted anything, because he loved to ride and because the cavalry was the glamorous arm, the arm of dash and tradition. His class standing and his demerits denied it to him. He was commissioned into the infantry instead, and he was furious about it, and he carried that grievance to the Philippines and then, eventually, into the strange new business of military aviation, which the Army in those years regarded as a curiosity somewhere between a science experiment and a circus act. The transfer to flight came in the spring of 1911. Arnold and another young officer were sent to Dayton, Ohio, to learn to fly at the school the Wright brothers had established. Now here is a detail worth getting right, because this audience gets it wrong all the time, and so do a great many books. Hap Arnold was not personally taught to fly by Orville or by Wilbur Wright. whatever you may have read. His instructor was a Wright Company pilot named Arthur Welsh, a good and careful flyer. Arnold soloed on the 13th of May, 1911, after a grand total of 3 hours and 48 minutes of instruction spread across a few weeks. Think about that number when you think about what training would later become under his command. Under 4 hours in the air, and they turned him loose. He earned one of the very first military aviator certificates, and he became one of the first 2 flight instructors the Army ever had. And then the dying started, because that is what early aviation was. In 1912, his own instructor, Arthur Welsh, was killed in a crash. A classmate of Arnold's was killed at the flying field that same autumn. Arnold himself crashed a seaplane into the water off the Massachusetts coast and came out with a torn chin and a salvaged wreck. Death was not an abstraction in that first generation of flyers. It was a face you knew at a dinner table that had one fewer chair every few months. And then came that spin over Fort Riley in November of 1912, the one we opened on, the moment the machine did something Arnold could not explain and nearly killed him for it. That was the breaking point. He grounded himself, and he did not come back to flying for years. I want you to hold on to that image of the frightened young man, because everything the older man later became was built on top of it. And I do not think you can understand Hap Arnold at all, unless you understand that he began as a man who had every reason to be afraid of the air. He conquered it, of course. He came back to flying, slowly, one short hop at a time, and he rose. But his career very nearly ended a second time, and this time, not from fear, but from politics. And this part matters enormously for the trial, because it tells you what kind of institution Arnold was fighting inside of. In the middle of the 1920s, the great prophet of American air power was a general named Billy Mitchell, a brilliant, arrogant, absolutely fearless advocate who believed that air power would decide the next war, and who said so, loudly, to superiors who did not want to hear it. When a Navy airship crashed and killed its crew, Mitchell publicly accused the War and Navy departments of something close to criminal negligence, and the court-martialed him for it. And Hap Arnold, who was Mitchell's protege and friend, testified for him. He stood up in that courtroom, a middling-ranked officer with a family to feed, and he took Mitchell's side against the entire weight of the Army establishment. Mitchell was convicted in December of 1925 and resigned. And Arnold, marked now as a Mitchell man, an agitator, a troublemaker, was exiled in 1926 to command a small observation squadron at Fort Riley, Kansas, a cavalry post out on the plains. Everyone understood what that posting meant. It was supposed to be the end of him. He was being buried alive, professionally, for the sin of being right too loudly in the wrong company. Now I want you to notice the deep irony that sits at the center of this whole story, because we're going to come back to it again and again. The young Hap Arnold was exactly the kind of officer that this channel usually champions. He was the maverick the system tried to bury. He was the man who told the truth and got sent to Kansas for it. He watched the establishment court-martial the most clear-sighted air advocate in the country, and he survived it, and he climbed back, and he rose all the way to the top of that same establishment. And the question the prosecution is going to ask you later on is whether the man who reached the summit remembered the lesson of the exile, or whether he became, in the end, the very kind of institution that had once tried to break him. He climbed back through the 1930s, through command of a field in California, through the staff schools, through sheer relentless competence and energy, and in September of 1938, he became chief of the Air Corps, when the officer holding that job was killed in a crash. And that is where the real story of what he built begins. When Arnold took over in the autumn of 1938, he inherited an organization of a little more than 20,000 men and roughly 800 first-line combat aircraft. Think about how small that is. That is not an air force capable of deciding a world war. That is barely an air force capable of defending a coastline. The United States, in 1938, ranked well behind a string of European powers in air strength. Arnold walked into a service that was an afterthought inside the Army, starved of money, blocked from promotion, its officers doubted, and its budgets raided by the ground generals who controlled them. 6 years later, the force he commanded numbered over 2.4 million men and women in uniform and nearly 80,000 aircraft. Let me set those two figures side by side, because the audience for this channel appreciates the sheer engineering scale of a thing. 20,000 men to 2.4 million, 800 aircraft to 80,000. That is a hundredfold growth in people in 6 years, built while the shooting was already going on, built while those same crews were flying and dying, built without stopping to catch a breath. American industry, driven hard by Arnold and by the men he pushed and threatened and cajoled, produced on the order of 300,000 military aircraft over the course of the war. In the single year of 1944, the country delivered close to 96,000 aircraft. There has never been an industrial mobilization to match it, before or since, and there's a strong and serious argument that Hap Arnold was its single most important military architect. The turning point that made it possible came in the White House in November of 1938, when Franklin Roosevelt called his military men in and told them he wanted a vast expansion of American air power, thousands upon thousands of aircraft, a number that made the ground generals blink. Arnold later called that day a battle won in the White House, and he meant it as a triumph, because for the first time, the highest authority in the land had said out loud that the future was in the air. The story goes that when word of the American production targets reached Germany, Hermann Goering laughed at them as fantasy. American industry would, in the end, deliver far more than even Roosevelt had asked for. Arnold had spent his whole career being told the air arm was a sideshow. Now he had a mandate to build it into the main event, and he seized that mandate with both hands and did not let go. And the whole rest of the story flows from the ferocity of that grip. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the man and the machine he built. Here's the thing the recruiting posters never showed you, though. That machine killed men before it ever reached the enemy. Building an air force that big, that fast, meant training pilots and navigators and bombardiers and gunners at a rate the world had never attempted. In crowded skies, in worn-out aircraft, in bad weather at night, under constant pressure from the top to produce crews faster and get them overseas. And they died doing it, in numbers that would stagger you. The best modern accounting of this comes from Anthony Marilis in his exhaustive study of fatal Army air accidents inside the United States during the war years. Marilis counted more than 15,500 pilots, crew members, and ground personnel killed in accidents on American soil between 1941 and 1945. Not in combat. Not over Berlin or over Tokyo. Over Texas and California and Kansas and the Gulf Coast, in training and in transit. More than 6,000 fatal accidents inside the continental United States. In the peak year alone, the toll ran to an average of roughly 10 dead men every single day after day, month after month, without a shot fired at them by any enemy. That is the equivalent of a full infantry division, wiped from the rolls before a single one of those men ever crossed an ocean. I want to be careful here, because you will fact-check me, and you should. That 15,000 figure is the stateside number, the men killed inside the country. Count the accidents overseas, the crashes on ferry flights across the oceans, the operational losses that were not combat, and the total climbs much higher, past 25,000 by some accountings. So when you hear the training toll quoted, understand precisely what is being counted. But the point stands either way, and it is this. Long before the bombing doctrine ever met the Luftwaffe, the sheer velocity of Arnold's expansion had a body count. That is, Exhibit 1 for the prosecution. And it is also, if you are being honest, a piece of evidence for the defense, because you simply cannot build 2.4 million men into a war-winning force in 6 years without accidents on a terrible scale, and every month you slow down to be safer is a month the enemy is not slowing down. Hold both of those thoughts in your hands at once. We are going to need them at the end. Now let us talk about the men Arnold drove, the commanders, because this is where the trial turns personal, and this is where the title of this story comes from. The first name is Ira Eaker. Eaker was one of Arnold's own, a protege, a friend, a man Arnold had known and trusted and mentored for years. In the early months of 1942, Eaker was sent to England to build the 8th Air Force from, and I am barely exaggerating, almost nothing at all. The story that gets told, and it is essentially true, is that he arrived with a small handful of officers and not one single combat aircraft of his own. From that beginning, Eaker built the force that would carry the American daylight bombing campaign into the heart of Nazi Germany. By late 1943, he commanded something on the order of 185,000 men and several thousand aircraft. He had done exactly what he was asked to do from a standing start in under 2 years, and he had done it under fire, and Arnold rode him the entire way. From his desk in Washington, thousands of miles from the flak, Arnold sent Eaker a steady, grinding stream of cables and letters, pushing, criticizing, demanding more missions, more bombers over the target, more results, and faster. The historian who edited Arnold's own wartime diaries described Arnold's mounting frustration at what he considered less than the maximum possible use of the 8th Air Force. Read that correspondence, and you can feel the pressure coming off the paper. Arnold wanted the bombers flying deeper, more often, in ever greater numbers. and he wanted it yesterday. And what makes it hard to watch is that Eaker's promised aircraft kept getting stripped away from him and shipped off to North Africa and the Pacific. Whole bomb groups diverted to other theaters, and yet the demands from Washington never once softened to match the reality on the ground. Eaker was being ordered to do more and more with a force that Washington itself kept raiding for parts. Then, at the very end of 1943, in the great reshuffle of command for the coming invasion of France, Arnold moved him. On paper, it looked like a promotion. Eaker was sent down to the Mediterranean to command a larger Allied air organization, and Jimmy Doolittle was brought in to take over the 8th. But Eaker did not experience it as a promotion. He fought the move hard. He did not want to leave the force he had built with his own hands on the very eve of its greatest battles, and hand it off to another man to lead over Berlin. By the accounts of those closest to him, he carried the wound of it for the rest of his life, a deep and bitter sense that he had been pushed aside by the very mentor he had served so loyally and so hard. And there is a detail here that I find almost unbearable. After the catastrophe of the second Schweinfurt raid, Eaker had written to Arnold that they must continue the battle with unrelenting fury. Those were his own words. And then Arnold decided that Eaker would not be the one to continue it. The man who wrote Unrelenting Fury was relieved of the command he had bled to build. The second name is Haywood Hansell, and his story is even sharper, and in some ways it is the cruelest single episode in the whole record. Hansell was not merely a commander. He was one of the intellectual fathers of the entire American theory of precision bombing, one of the officers who had helped write the master air war plan that shaped everything that followed. He believed in daylight precision bombing the way a devout man believes in his faith. It was not just his job, it was his conviction, the thing he had staked his professional life on. And in the autumn of 1944, Arnold gave him the 21st Bomber Command in the Mariana Islands and the brand new B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the world, and told him to go and prove the theory over Japan. It did not work. And here is the crucial thing. It did not fail because Hansell was a poor leader. It failed because the theory ran headlong into a wall of physical reality that no leader could have wished away. At the altitudes the B-29s flew over Japan, the crews found a river of wind we now call the jet stream, winds of well over 100 miles per hour that could fling a bomber across the sky and make precision aiming a fantasy. The targets were hidden under cloud most of the time. The engines on the early B-29s, the big Wright R-3350s, overheated and caught fire and failed with brutal regularity, and men died in the ocean on the long flights out and back. Hansell sent his crews out again and again, obedient to the doctrine he had helped create, and the bombs fell into the sea and into the empty fields, and the Japanese factories kept right on running. By the record of those raids, only a tiny fraction of the bombs landed anywhere near where they were aimed. And Arnold, in Washington, with $3 billion of the nation's treasure sunk into the B-29 program, with his own reputation and the entire post-war future of an independent Air Force riding on this one airplane, ran out of patience. He sent his deputy, Loris Norstad, all the way out to the Marianas to relieve Hansell in person and to put Curtis LeMay in his place. It happened on the 20th of January, 1945. And the human detail of it is what stays with you long after the dates fade. Norstad later described Arnold as a man genuinely torn between real affection for Hansell and the cold arithmetic of results. And Hansell himself took the blow with a terrible, quiet grace. He asked only one thing, that his friends not waste their energy trying to find him some other important post to soften the fall, because, in his own words, his energies were, at least for the moment, spent. He had been relieved of what he himself called the best job in the Air Force, for the crime of believing in the doctrine that the Air Force had trained him to believe in. I find that one of the quietly devastating moments of the entire war. The institution built a man's whole career and identity around a theory, and then it broke him on the very day that theory failed to deliver, and it handed his command to a man willing to throw the theory away. And here, I think, is the pattern the prosecution wants you to see, and it is worth naming as plainly as I can. Arnold relieved Kenneth Wolfe from the 20th Bomber Command in the summer of 1944, when the earlier China-based B-29 effort stalled. He rode Ira Eaker until he moved him out. He broke Haywood Hansell. And when LeMay took over, Arnold made the terms brutally clear. Produce results, or you too will be gone. LeMay understood it exactly, and he said as much later. He knew that Arnold had crawled out on a limb 1,000 times over to build these airplanes and win the money to pay for them, and he knew that Arnold was absolutely determined to wring results out of the machine, whatever it took and whoever it cost. That determination was the engine of the whole American Air Force. It built 2.4 million men and 80,000 aircraft. It was also a blade held over the neck of every single commander Arnold ever appointed. And, if this sounds familiar to some of you, if you have spent a career inside a large organization and watched the person who actually understood the work get pushed aside, while the pressure from above never let up for one single day, you are not imagining the pattern. It is older than any of us, and it runs through every institution ever built by ambitious men. It just does not usually get this many people killed. Now we come to the very heart of the case against him, which is the doctrine itself, and the year that doctrine finally came due. That year was 1943, and it was written in blood. The theory Arnold championed, the theory Hansel helped author and Eaker executed, was daylight precision bombing without fighter escort. The idea was elegant, and drawn on a blackboard in a classroom it was almost beautiful. You would send heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator, in tight defensive formations, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, flying high in broad daylight, and they would defend one another with overlapping, interlocking fields of fire. They would punch through to the target, drop with precision from high altitude, and come home. The bomber, the theorists taught, would always get through. Escort fighters, in this clean and confident vision, were very nearly unnecessary, because the bomber formation was understood to be its own escort. It was a doctrine developed through the 1930s by clever, dedicated men in a schoolhouse, many of whom had never flown a single combat mission against a modern, radar-directed, cannon-armed air defense, for the simple reason that no such defense had yet existed for them to fly against. 1943 is the year the Luftwaffe graded that homework, and it graded it without mercy. Start with Ploesti, the 1st of August, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave. The target was the great oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania, the fuel that ran a large part of the German war machine, one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. It sent 178 B-24 Liberators and only B-24 Liberators. Note that no fortresses on this one, low, right down on the deck, treetop height, to hit the refineries by surprise and slip away before the defenses could react. The surprise failed almost from the start. Navigation errors scattered the formations. The Germans and Romanians were alert and waiting, and the Liberators flew straight into a curtain of flak fired at point-blank range, some of it from guns hidden in haystacks and disguised freight cars. Of the 178 bombers that set out, 53 were destroyed and 55 more came home damaged. More than 300 airmen were killed. Over 100 were taken prisoner and dozens more were interned after crossing into neutral Turkey. 5 men earned the Medal of Honor for that single day, 3 of them awarded posthumously, the most medals of honor ever given for one air action in history. And the refineries, the entire point of the sacrifice, were repaired and back near full production within a matter of weeks. That is Exhibit 2, and it is a bitter one. Then came Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 17th of August, 1943, the very same month. A deep, ambitious double strike into the German interior, aimed at the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt fighter factory at Regensburg. Ball bearings were thought to be a choke point, a single vulnerable joint in the whole German war economy. The fortresses went in without escort for the deepest and most dangerous stretch of the route, because the escort fighters of that moment, above all the sturdy P-47 Thunderbolt, simply did not yet have the fuel range to go the full distance and return. The German fighters, freed from any fear of American escorts over the target, formed up and attacked in waves, with cannon, with rockets, hour after hour. 60 bombers were lost that day, roughly 1 in 5 of the entire attacking force. Individual groups were gutted beyond recognition. Some lost 40 and even 50% of the crews they had launched that morning. And the establishment's considered answer to 60 bombers lost and 600 men gone was to study the results, absorb the shock, rebuild the groups, and plan to go back and do it again. Which brings us to the 14th of October, 1943, Black Thursday, the second raid on Schweinfurt. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses were dispatched into the very teeth of the strongest fighter defenses in Germany, and once again, without escort the whole way to the target. 60 of those bombers did not come back at all. Some accounts, counting the aircraft that limped home so badly shot up that they never flew again, put the true loss closer to 77. More than 100 additional bombers were damaged. Around 600 men were killed, wounded, or missing in a single afternoon over one German city. To put that in a frame this audience will feel in the gut, the 8th Air Force lost more airmen on that one October afternoon than Royal Air Force Fighter Command lost, across the entire Battle of Britain. And in the grim days that followed, the truth finally landed in the headquarters in England with a weight that could not be argued away. The deep, unescorted daylight raid was not survivable, not against defenses like these. The bomber did not always get through. The theory, the elegant, beloved institutional theory, was wrong, and it had been proven wrong in the only currency that mattered, which was young men who did not come home. And I want you to understand what these men actually endured up there, because the doctrine reads clean on paper, and it was anything but clean in the sky. They flew in a formation the planners called the combat box, a rigid, stacked arrangement of fortresses layered at different heights so that the guns of one bomber could cover the blind spots of another. It looked orderly from a briefing map. From inside it, it was a slow-moving target held together by nerve. They flew at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the temperature outside the thin aluminum skin fell to 40 and 50 degrees below zero, cold enough that a gunner who touched bare metal with a bare hand left his skin behind, cold enough that a jammed gun had to be cleared with fingers that were already going numb. The oxygen came through a mask, and if the mask iced up or the line was cut, a man could pass out and be dead before anyone noticed. Then came the flak over the target, the black bursts of the German 88mm guns walking up toward the formation, and the fighters slashing through the boxes head-on. And through all of it, the formation had to hold, straight and level, because breaking formation meant losing the mutual fire and dying alone. The ball turret gunner rode outside the aircraft entirely, folded into a plexiglass sphere slung under the belly, hanging over occupied Europe with the earth turning far below him. That is the cockpit the doctrine sent them into, again and again, and it is worth holding that picture in your mind while the generals argue over percentages. I want to give you the one number that makes all of this personal, the number that tells you exactly what it was like to be one of these men in that year. The historian Donald Miller, in his book Masters of the Air, which I know many of you have read, records that, of the flyers assigned to one particular bomb group when it first arrived in England in the spring of 1943, only 14% lived to complete their 25th mission. 14%. Sit in that cold cockpit for a moment and do the arithmetic yourself. Look at the man on your left and the man on your right, and understand that all three of you, statistically, are gone before any one of you finishes his tour. A bomber crewman in 1943 had a worse chance of surviving his required missions than of dying. That is not a war story. That is a probability. And it was a probability that men sitting safely in headquarters could read off a page just as clearly as any frightened boy in a ball turret could feel it in his stomach at 20,000 feet. And this is the sharpest point of the whole prosecution's case, so let me put it to you as fairly and as hard as I possibly can. Tammy Davis Biddle, in her serious and careful scholarly study, Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, argues that the air power advocates vastly oversold what strategic bombing could actually do, that they built their entire case on assumptions that turned out to be substantially wrong, and that they clung to those assumptions long past the point where the evidence in front of them should have forced a change of mind. She writes about cognitive error, about bias, about true believers defending a cherished theory against the mounting facts. And Hap Arnold was the single most powerful true believer of them all. He did not personally invent the doctrine, that is fair to him, but he commanded the force that flew it. He pushed that force to fly it harder and deeper, and when the lost reports came back from Ploesti and from Schweinfurt, he did not stop. He pressed on. In my view, this is the strongest single charge that can be laid against him, stronger than the relief of any one commander. He had the numbers. The numbers told him, in plain and undeniable arithmetic, that the theory was killing his crews faster than it was hurting Germany, and for months he kept sending them into it. That is the case against Hap Arnold. It is a serious case, and I do not think any honest person can simply wave it away. Now let me turn, because a fair trial absolutely demands it, to the case for the defense. And I will tell you now, the defense is stronger than the prosecution ever wants to admit. Here's the first thing the defense will put in front of you. The doctrine failed, yes, but Arnold is also the man who fixed it. In the summer of 1943, while he was recovering from one of his heart attacks, an advisor named Robert Lovett came back from a hard look at England and told Arnold plainly that the bombers simply had to have a fighter that could escort them the whole way to the target and back again. And Arnold wrote what some historians regard as the most important single memo of his entire war, demanding a true long-range escort fighter over Germany by the start of 1944. The airplane that finally answered that demand was the P-51 Mustang, once it was mated to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. With its clean, efficient wing and its drop tanks, the Mustang could do what the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning could not quite manage. It could go all the way to Berlin, and it could fight the moment it got there. And when Doolittle took over the 8th from Eaker, he made the other half of the fix, and it was a decision of pure nerve. Instead of chaining the escort fighters tight to the bombers in a purely defensive screen, hugging the formations, Doolittle set them free. He let them range out ahead and hunt the German fighters wherever they could be found before they ever reached the bombers. The bomber crews called the little escort fighters their little friends, and now those little friends were let off the leash to go on the attack. The historians Stephen McFarland and Wesley Newton, in their study To Command the Sky, locate the winning of air superiority over Germany precisely there, in the arrival of the long-range escort fighter combined with the decision to let it hunt. The loss rates fell. The same crews who had been slaughtered without mercy in 1943 would, by the following spring, roam over Germany in broad daylight while American fighters swept the sky clean ahead of them. So the defense says this, and it is a powerful thing to say. Arnold backed the very solution that broke the deadly stalemate his own doctrine had created. A truly stubborn man, a mere fanatic, would have gone on dying in defense of the old theory to the bitter end. Arnold changed course. He changed it late, and good men died in the gap between the failure and the fix, and that is on his ledger forever. But he did change, and the change won the air. Here's the second thing the defense will tell you. And on this one, I think the defense scores heavily. Hermann Wolk, in his study Cataclysm on Arnold and the Defeat of Japan, judges that the relief of Hansel and the elevation of LeMay was not an act of cruelty, but an act of command, and that it was, in fact, a genuine turning point in the Pacific War. Hansel's precision doctrine was not working over Japan for all the reasons we have seen, the wind and the cloud and the failing engines. LeMay's radical shift to low-altitude night incendiary attack, whatever else you may think of it, and we will come to what you might think of it, broke the stalemate and helped bring the war to an end. From the chair Arnold actually sat in, the choice was never between a kind decision and a cruel one. It was between a commander who was not delivering and a commander who might. And Wolk's point is blunt and hard to answer. Wars are not won by leaving a beloved man in a job he cannot do out of loyalty and affection. While the enemy is still killing your people every single day, the war goes on. And then there is the biography itself, which the defense will place in front of you last, because it is the most human piece of evidence in the entire trial. Remember the frightened young man spinning down out of the Kansas sky. Remember that this was a man who had to conquer a real and reasonable terror of flight before he could command so much as a single squadron. Dick Allen Dasso, whose biography, Hap Arnold and the Evolution of American Air Power, is one of the essential works on the man, makes the case that Arnold was not merely a driver of other men, but a genuine visionary in his own right. The officer who understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in uniform, that the next war would be won in the laboratory just as much as in the sky. Arnold reached out to the great scientist Theodore von Karman and set him and a team of the finest minds he could find the task of thinking 20 years ahead, past the war entirely, toward supersonic flight, toward pilotless aircraft, toward intercontinental rockets carrying warheads, toward refueling aircraft in the air, toward radar and the jet engine. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, came out of the drive Arnold put behind jet propulsion, and I will note for the record, because you would catch me if I did not, that the P-80 did not see combat in this war. Arnold founded the research effort that would grow into the organization we now know as RAND. He fought the future war in factories and laboratories and universities, while other men fought the present one in the field. That is not the record of a mere martinet with a temper. That is the record of a builder who could see clear over the horizon, and it belongs in the scale when you weigh him. Now, before I bring the two cases together for you, I owe you the most personal part of the evidence of all, the part that speaks directly to what building this thing cost the man himself. Because the title of the story says that he broke the men who flew for him. It does not say that he spared himself. He did not spare himself, not for one day. Hap Arnold suffered, by the standard count, 4 heart attacks during the Second World War. Some accounting say 5, if you include the one that struck him in 1948, after the war, while he was laboring over his memoirs. The first came in the winter of 1943, around the time he pinned on his 4th star. By the Army's own regulations, that attack should have pointed him straight toward retirement, but Franklin Roosevelt personally intervened to let him stay on the condition that he report on his health every month. The second attack came in the spring of that same year. He spent the better part of 2 weeks in the hospital at Walter Reed, and then, against the express wishes of George Marshall, the man who protected him and promoted him and worried over him like a brother, Arnold got up out of that hospital bed and went and delivered the commencement address at West Point that June because his own son was among the graduating cadets. The third heart attack came a year later, in the spring of 1944, and the historians tie it directly to the crushing strain of the B-29 program, the $3 billion gamble that was, at that very moment, refusing to work. He took a month to recover, and then he flew to England and stood on the sand of Omaha Beach less than a week after the invasion to see the thing with his own eyes. And the fourth attack came in January of 1945, within days of the moment he broke Haywood Hansel and installed Curtis LeMay in his place. I want you to sit with that timing, because I do not think it is a coincidence, and I do not think you will either. In the same handful of January days in which he relieved the loyal friend who had believed in the doctrine, Arnold's own heart failed him for the fourth time. George Marshall pleaded with him, again and again, to rest, to put down some part of the enormous weight he insisted on carrying, warning him in almost these exact words that he could not possibly recover if he kept overrunning his own internal machinery. Arnold would not stop. After that fourth attack, he flew out to the Pacific, out to Guam, to push the campaign forward in person, standing over the men who were pushing the crews. He drove himself, in the plainest possible terms, against clear medical advice and against his own failing heart. And I do not believe you can fully judge the man who drove Eaker and Hansel so mercilessly hard until you have truly sat with the fact that he drove himself harder still, and that it very nearly killed him 4 separate times. So what on earth do we do with all of this? Let me bring the Pacific story to its end first, because it is where the two cases collide most violently of all, and then I'm going to hand this over to you, where it belongs. When Curtis LeMay accepted the terms Arnold had laid down, produce results or be gone, he made a decision that ended the stalemate over Japan, and that remains, to this day, one of the most fiercely argued decisions of the entire war. He looked at the failure of high-altitude precision bombing, and he threw the whole doctrine out. He stripped much of the defensive gun armament off his B-29s to let them carry more bombs, he loaded them with incendiaries, with fire, and he sent them in low at night, over a city built largely of wood and paper. On the night of the 9th of March, 1945, running into the small hours of the 10th, he sent more than 300 B-29s toward Tokyo, and 279 of them dropped their fire over the crowded eastern half of the city. What followed was the single most destructive air attack in all of human history. The best estimates place the dead somewhere between 90,000 and more than 100,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, in one single night. 1 million more were left homeless. 16 square miles of the city simply burned away. And I have to be honest with you about that number, 90,000 to 100,000, because it is disputed, and it is disputed for the grimmest reason imaginable, which is that a firestorm of that intensity does not leave behind a tidy count of the dead. However you set the figure, and reasonable historians set it differently, more human beings died in Tokyo that one night than would die in the first hours at Hiroshima or at Nagasaki. And Arnold's fingerprints are on it. The scholar William Ralph has argued directly that the firebombing came about because of Arnold's relentless, unyielding pressure to make strategic bombing produce visible, undeniable headline results, combined with LeMay's willingness to gamble everything to give the old man exactly those results. The pressure that broke Eaker and broke Hansel did not vanish when LeMay walked into the command tent. It simply found, at long last, a commander ruthless enough and cold-blooded enough to convert that pressure into fire. That is the terrible internal logic of the prosecution's case, followed all the way to its final and most disturbing conclusion. The very same drive that built the greatest air force on Earth is the same drive that put the fire over Tokyo. You cannot fully separate them. They run down the same wire. The defense answers, and it answers seriously, and you must let it answer, that the firebombing helped end the war, that every additional week the war dragged on. Men died by the thousands all across the Pacific. Prisoners died in the camps, and civilians died under a brutal occupation across the whole of Asia. The defense says that the men making these decisions believed, whether they were finally right or finally wrong, that they were trading a smaller horror now against a far larger horror later. Arnold is on the record wanting the war ended, and ended fast. And the defense will remind you, pointedly, that you are sitting in a comfortable chair 80 years later, in a peace those men bought, passing judgment on decisions made by exhausted men with failing hearts, who were trying to end the worst war in the history of the world with the imperfect and terrible tools that were actually in their hands. I told you at the very start that I would not hand you a verdict, and I'm going to keep that promise, because I honestly do not believe there is a clean one to give. But I will tell you what I have come to believe about how to weigh it, and then the decision passes to you. I believe, first, that the official history is the wrong place to go looking for the verdict, and it is worth telling you why. The great multi-volume official history of the Army Air Forces in the war, written by Craven and Cate, was commissioned in part at Ira Eaker's own initiative, and it was written close to the events by people who were themselves inside the institution. It is magnificent for the facts, for the dates, for the movements of the groups and the tonnages of the bombs and the strengths of the units. I have leaned on it, and this channel always will. But it is not the place to go for a genuine prosecution of Arnold's relentlessness, because it was never built to prosecute the men who built it. For that harder and colder judgment, you have to go to the later, more independent scholars, to Biddle on the failures of the doctrine, to Ralph on the coming of the fire, to Dasso and the other biographers who could afford to be honest precisely because they did not owe their careers or their commissions to the man in the dock. And I believe, second, having weighed all of it as carefully as I know how, that the two halves of this story cannot actually be pulled apart, and that this, right here, is the real reason the trial is so hard, and the real reason I will not close it for you. It is tempting, it is so tempting, to say that Arnold could have built the great Air Force without breaking the men, that some kinder, gentler commander could have reached the very same result with less cruelty and less blood spilled. I do not think the evidence supports that comforting story, and I suspect that this audience, so many of you having spent your working lives inside large and demanding institutions, already knows in your bones that it does not. The sheer velocity that turned 20,000 men into 2.4 million in 6 short years is the very same velocity that produced more than 15,000 training deaths on American soil. The iron stubbornness that held the daylight doctrine a full year too long is the very same stubbornness that then forced through the long-range escort and won command of the sky. The pressure that broke Haywood-Hansel is the very same pressure that ended the war over Japan in fire. You do not get to keep the general who built the greatest air force on earth and quietly trade away the general who broke the men who flew it. They are the same general. They were always, from the beginning, the same man. That, I have come to think, is the true and deeply uncomfortable finding of this whole trial, and it is exactly why I will not pretend to deliver the sentence for you. Henry Harley Arnold received his 5th star on the 21st of December, 1944, the first airman in American history ever to hold that rank. Years later, after the Air Force he had fought and bled and nearly died, for finally became its own independent service, his rank was made over into a title that no other human being has ever held, before or since General of the Air Force. He remains the only man ever to wear 5 stars in 2 different American services. He left active duty, and he went home to a ranch in California. And there, on the 15th of January, 1950, at the age of 63, his heart finally gave all that it had left to give. He had built the thing that, as a frightened young lieutenant, he had been too terrified to fly. And the men who flew it for him paid a price that we are still, all these long years later, trying to add up. So I am going to leave the verdict exactly where it belongs, which is with you. Was Hap Arnold a great man who did hard and necessary and terrible things in a hard and terrible time? The indispensable builder, without whom the air war might have been lost? Or was he a driven true believer whose relentlessness cost far more lives than it ever truly needed to? A man who became at last the very kind of unfeeling institution that had once tried to bury him at Fort Riley? Or is the honest and difficult answer that he was both of those men at once, inseparably, and that greatness at that scale, in a war like that one, simply cannot be purchased without a cost that looks, up close, a great deal like this? Tell me in the comments how you weigh it. I read them, and on this one especially, I genuinely want to know where you come down, because I am not certain I have come down anywhere myself, and I want to hear the stories. So many of you had fathers and grandfathers in this. If your father or grandfather flew with the 8th Air Force over Germany, or crewed a B-29 over Japan, or worked the flight line in the mud and the cold, or trained in those crowded and dangerous skies over Texas and California, and never saw combat at all, I would like to hear about him. Those men are the real evidence in this trial, and their stories matter more than any generals. Drop them below, and I will read every one. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.